Hello, friends of the channel Authors Chat, Beth Jordan. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Yanni, and I am a young writer, poet, writing mainly in Greek and English. And today I have with me Beth Jordan. Hi, Beth. How are you?
Hi, Yanni. I'm very well, thank you. And how are you doing today?
I'm very well indeed. I'm quite fascinated in being in this position and place to interview you and ask you to share your own insights as a writer with the rest of the indie authors on how you refine your own writing style, what are your own topics that inspire you to write, and all the characters that you like building in your books, which are going to follow later. So, are you ready to go with me through this interview?
Yes, I'm now here on camera with you and ready to go. And thank you for actually taking the time to interview me. It is quite something, and it's not often that I actually talk about the book that I wrote about a year ago now. My first debut novel. Obviously, it was a debut novel, it's my first book. And so it'll be interesting to hear the questions you're going to ask me and see whether or not I can give a good explanation as to the questions you ask.
I have to be honest and tell you that I'm a follower of your channel and I've watched most of the interviews you've done. And I said to myself, you need to answer some of these questions you ask yourself. So, this is a brilliant opportunity for the rest of us to know a little bit more about you
Okay,
and
thank you.
your uh, talent. So, my first question towards yourself would be, you have accumulated remarkable experience spanning from nursing, teaching, textiles, entrepreneurship, and writing.
Mhm.
At the same time, your life events range from a plentiful selection of countries and wide time frames. How has this incredibly diverse background influenced your approach to storytelling, particularly in your debut novel, Thank You for the Kiss, and your upcoming biography memoir, Don't Shout, I Can Hear You?
Wow, that was a long question. I hope I can remember most of what you actually asked me. So I'd say that each of the careers that I've been following, whether completely or not completely, have been very people-centric. So my careers have been involved when I was nursing, obviously with patients, when I was teaching with children, when I was at textiles, it was a lot to do with traveling overseas to China and India, um, mixing with cultures, especially China that I'd never ever mixed with, totally different to the one that I was brought up in, which was in India. So I would say that meeting all these very, very diverse people created in me a sense of great empathy for culture and for the way people live their lives. And in terms of anthropology in culture, there are similarities and differences. And I've loved anthropology for a long time, but that we can talk about that later on. So I think the fact that I've mixed with so many different peoples in the world, um, not necessarily speaking their language, but definitely observing the way they behave and the way they talk and picking up on the stories that they tell. I think little by little, that must have sunk into my unconscious mind or subconscious mind and stayed there. And when I was traveling around, I never thought that I would become a writer, although I did keep a diary when I was traveling, mainly when I was traveling, not for my everyday life. So I kept several travel diaries, hoping that maybe someday, who knows, I would write a story, but I would never know quite what sort of story I was going to write. And so here I am, after many years of traveling, having written my first novel, Thank You for the Kiss, which in fact was set in Cuba.
And I would like to congratulate you on that. I've heard and I've seen the feedback is quite high and of considerable quality. And you're going to tell us about that a bit later towards the end. It's a bonus question, I would say.
Okay.
And the next question I would like to ask you is, Your debut novel, Thank You for the Kiss, explores themes of cultural identity, grief, and projects self-discovery and resilience. What drew you to set your novel in Cuba, in that country? And how did you incorporate your own experiences and observations into the narrative?
Okay, so my novel is a memoir. And as you know, when you start to write memoir, there is a sense of fiction in the story. So I didn't actually choose to set my novel in Cuba. It was a place I visited, and I visited Cuba. It was on holiday. And while I was in Cuba, I met a lot of people, and things happened. Things happened that eventually, those things that happened over a period of 9 months, I decided to write about them. And I decided to write about that particular country because, funnily enough, it reminded me very much of the country where I was born, which was India. It had, when I went to Cuba back in 2015, it had a sense of retro. I remember thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to love it here because there isn't the sense of glamour. This isn't the sense of generic shops that I'm seeing around the world. This is still a place that seems to be caught in a time warp. And I really, really liked that. I had the sense that I was going to go back in time and I was going to really love being in the space where I was. So that's how basically, when I say not that, that's where the story was set because I visited that place. And I really fell in love with Cuba. I don't know if you can ever say you fall in love with the country, but I really did. I just loved this feeling it had, this island, the similarity to my childhood, the community life that Cuba has throughout the whole island. Often I think that everybody knows everybody, and they have a link to each other throughout the whole of Cuba. And I think the other thing is that I noticed, maybe it's historical, maybe it's things I've read about Cuba, but the people I met, they were real family country people, and they had a sense of resilience that I really admired. And at the time when I went to Cuba, I was in quite a bad state of grief. I really was. My mother had died. My marriage had broken down completely. And I didn't know what I was going to do. Thought maybe I'd find a new life in Cuba. I was a bit far-fetched in a way. But so when I went there, I wasn't in a great space. And I think because I wasn't in a great space, I really began to empathize with the people I met. I looked at their lives. I went and met the families. I had parties with them, picnics with them. I danced with them, drank rum and coke with them. And I seemed to really bond with the local people. And
Okay, I see.
yeah, but of course, in the story, there is, aside from all this wonderful Caribbean Latin music and sense of um, um, carefreeness, there was a very dark side to Cuba. And that's a part that I actually experienced that I didn't expect to experience when I went there. And it became, as time went by, almost like a dantesque inferno. So the story started off as being full of light and hope and resilience and possibilities and ended up in quite a dark space. Yeah.
Okay, I see. I have to admit, I have read your book and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And the main character, Gina, who is being depicted and described in the book, is the protagonist of your novel.
Mhm.
She undergoes a journey of personal transformation throughout the story. Can you discuss the origins behind her character, some traits of her, and expand on the challenges she faces as she navigates through grief and deception in a foreign land? So, what is that dantesque inferno you referred earlier?
Well, if I have to explain what a dantesque inferno was, I'd be giving away the whole story. So listeners are going to have to read the book to find out what that dantesque inferno. actually was about and what actually did take place. And some people may say, well, I don't think it was a dantesque inferno, but from my personal experience, that's how I observed it, and that's how I felt it to be. So the memoir is actually based on the author's own life and experiences. She definitely, as Gina in the story, has a very adventurous soul and constantly inquisitive, always looking for the slight danger around because it kind of is a buzz to her. And she's always been like that all her life. And at the same time as being an adventurer, the underlying grief that Gina experiences, what it did to her, which was really interesting, is it subverted her usual decision-making process. So the author, in fact, I myself, when I traveled abroad, I was very, very careful to respect the culture in which I was actually entering into. I observed the way I dressed, the way I behaved, the way I interacted with people. I was always very respectful of them. Um, but this time round, in a place like Cuba, which I think has got a certain magic to it, I think a lot of people who've gone to Cuba may feel that there's a magic on the island that really infuses one with, I don't know, maybe fairy dust. And I know that in the story, Gina makes decisions that if she hadn't been in a state of grief, she would not have actually gone down the path that she does go down in the story. So her decision-making process is completely subverted. And she, in fact, succumbs to the locals' need to escape and flee because in Cuba, and I have to be really careful because this is all my opinion, in Cuba, it's like a paradise island. And one of the characters that she met was a young dancer. And she, Gina and he had been dancing on the pavement. So salsa music playing, and he gets up and he says, "Come on, Gina, let's dance." So they start dancing on the street, and people are coming along and taking videos of the two of them dancing. And then they sit down and they have a drink together. And he says, "Do you know, living in Cuba is like being a bird in a gilded cage. It's so beautiful, but I'm totally trapped here. I'm a young man. What am I going to do with my life in a place like Cuba?" So there is this image of beauty, and within that image of beauty in Cuba, and the beautiful beaches, and the palm trees, and the music, and the drink, and dancing, the people, a lot of the people themselves, who are especially the younger ones now, are trapped. They don't have the money to leave the country. They don't have the money to do what they do. A lot of them are very educated, university level and beyond. And when they leave, they don't have the jobs to match their training. They're frustrated. They work as kitchen helpers. They work as dancers in, like, say, Club Tropicana in Havana, and they get paid very little money. So there is this really, I call it the dark side. We, as a tourist, you only see the bright side of something. It's not until you go deeper into a country like Cuba, you go and meet the people, you live their lives. And fortunately for Gina, she was able to go deep into the countryside, meet the families, eat with them. Even though she couldn't speak Spanish and they couldn't speak English, they communicated really well. But Gina finds herself quite trapped eventually. And there was a part of her, that a kind of warrior self of hers, that had to eventually start to rise to the surface, to realize that she had been trapped. She had to get out of that being trapped if she was going to survive the experiences that she had. And so the story unfolds. And again, I can't tell you anymore, otherwise I'm giving the story away.
No, I think you have already attracted us. It's appealing the way you said it. The way you set the stage is quite appealing to everyone, I guess. Uh, so this would be a good bridge with the next question, the way that you set the landscape and the cultural habits of the locals. So your bio mentions a deep interest in anthropology and a passion for exploring global cultures.
Yeah.
How did your studies in anthropology inform your writing process, particularly in capturing the cultural nuances and complexities depicted in your novel?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, first of all, in studying anthropology, which was a very long time ago, it was the early 2000s, I studied with Birkbeck College in London. And I studied it, I think, for almost 2 years. Didn't get a degree. That wasn't my aim. But one of the things that I had a wonderful teacher called Yasmin Hales. And one of the things that uh, came out of studying anthropology was, as I mentioned much earlier in our conversation, the differences in the cultural nuances in each culture, although they're different, they're very similar to ours. And so every country I went to, whether it was in India or China or anywhere else in the Far East or Brazil, I realized that in order to really enjoy the country in which I was going to visit, I really had to respect the culture. I had to understand that if they did things differently and I didn't like it and I felt uncomfortable, well, I had to step back from that and say, okay, it's not how I would do it. That's how they do it. It's not really impacting upon my life in any particular way. I'm only a visitor. So why not just accept how they are, accept the culture and enjoy and learn a new culture? And by learning about the new culture, it really brought a lot of richness to my life. It really gave me a very broad aspect upon living and how to think and how to behave and how to accept. And I think that's really important. We have this travel broadens the mind, and it can do if you allow it to broaden the mind. I have had situations when I remember speaking to somebody on a plane landing at Holguin Airport and just chatting to the guy. And I said, "How many times have you been to Cuba?" He says, "Oh, I've been coming for the last 10 years." I said, "Wow, that's amazing. You must know Cuba really well." And looked at me and says, "No, no, 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 no. My wife and I will just stay in the hotel in Baradero, and maybe we'll go out to Havana for the day, and that's it." I said, "What do you mean that's it? That's it." And I had to stop. I was just about to be critical, and I stopped. I said, "Okay. So unless you're really willing to open your mind, travel around, get out of your resort, and go and meet the people, I don't think you're really going to be able to understand the country in which you are visiting." And reading a book about, no, sorry, not reading a book, reading newspapers, particularly articles, is not going to inform you that well. So that whole background of studying anthropology, plus the fact that I did come from India, which was a very different culture to anything that we have here, that really taught me an awful lot about cultural diversity. And so when I went to Cuba and I experienced what I actually experienced, um, it did help me a great deal because the Cuban culture is very different to what I'd experienced in India or in China, totally different. Latin American, they speak Spanish. I didn't speak a word of Spanish. At least in China, I could speak English to the Chinese or India, but not in Cuba. So that was an interesting difficulty, which we overcame it. But I think what was interesting about Cuba is that I wanted to paint Cuba uh, as a background of hope and inspiration through the way the people behaved, their pride, and although they were trapped in a time warp and desperate for change, there was always this resilience to them that I so admired. And in a way, I suppose, in a way, I wanted to paint Cuba like a tapestry. So Cuba is a tapestry, it's the background. And all the events that took place in the story just wove itself in and out of the background of Cuba. So Cuba wasn't, in a way, the main bit, it was the background. And all the events that took place were woven in and out of this particular culture because it's this culture that affected the behavior of the protagonist.
I have to say that your vocabulary is amazing. You're really an eloquent writer. And the times I had to go in Google and translate the words into Greek is innumerable. So I have to admit that you're a really eloquent writer. So how is that setting of Cuba portrayed as both enchanting and perilous in your novel? Can you discuss your approach to depicting Cuba's landscape and its people, balancing the allure of the country with the darker aspects of Gina's experience?
Mm. It's quite a difficult question to answer in a way. because it's visually what I saw Cuba as the island. So there was the visual side of Cuba. You sit in the car and you go mad down a road and you rush past palm trees and tobacco fields and people planting and guys sitting on horse-drawn carts, and you go into Havana, and it's Havana Vieja is really as though you're walking into Granada in Spain or in Sevilla in Spain, and it's beautiful. The architecture is magnificent. It's the old Spanish architecture. It has white plazas. It has arched walkways along beautiful buildings, steeples, churches. Everything's really beautiful. So you have all of this beauty. And then Gina gets involved with a man. And she, I would say, is quite a naive person for all her travels, being married, whatever. She's still quite naive. And she always has a sense of optimism about people and the goodness of people. So when she meets this particular man, she doesn't have any visual or any future idea of the trouble she was going to get herself into. She goes along with hope and wanting to help. She starts off wanting to help somebody to improve that person's life because she feels very rich in what she's had. And she looks at this person and she sees a young man who hasn't got very much, but she has no clue about this guy. She has no clue that he's a lot sharper and wiser than she will ever be in her entire life. And she gets drawn and pulled into the magic of this place and her desires for change. And like gradually getting pulled into it, she gets pulled in deeper and deeper. It's almost like being pulled into the spider's web. Very much, if you remember the scene from Lord of the Rings, when Frodo gets entangled in the web of the big spider, and that's exactly what happens to Gina in Cuba.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
in that spiraling of that web, she's drawn into the darkness of the events that take place. I hope that answers your question.
No, totally. And I find interesting this contrast between a phenomenally paradise with the people residing in that paradise and the way they live their lives and the way they interact with the foreigners. But there's always the heart of the communities that very few people have tried to understand and explore. And I
Yeah,
think you are one of them.
yeah.
And
And I
that
think, yes, so,
resonates in your book quite clearly.
yeah. And I think what's interesting, and again, my experience is limited, and I'm careful to voice this. I think what I observed is that because Cuba and its policies are the way they are, it's almost more nannified than that of England when the national health came along and made, in many ways, England a nannified country. So the people get a lot of support from the government in terms of transportation, housing. They get food coupons. They're supported. They get all their education is free. They get all their medical help is all for free. So they're given a lot of things for free because they're not paid much money. So there is this kind of constantly being looked after that, and again, something I observed changes the way people take responsibility for the things that happen in their lives. And maybe I'm totally wrong, but I think this kind of being looked after in a state, I think particularly the men seem to not have stepped up as much as the women have over there. I remember I was talking to, well, be careful. Gina was talking to the casa particular owner, and she was complaining about her husband. And she said all her husband is good for is to get dressed up in his white shirt and his white jeans and slick back hair and perfume and go off and have drinks with his friends. And he's absolutely no good in bed. Not interested in bed. He's interested in dressing up. And I looked at her and I didn't know what to say. I understood, even though she spoke in Spanish, I actually understood exactly what she was saying. So there is the sense that you have people who are highly educated, but they're not allowed to flourish and become the full people that they would really like to become. And that was my observation. And that to me is
Thank you.
darkness.
Thank you for sharing that.
Hmm.
Thank you. It's important to someone to share their experiences and thoughts with the rest, so we can know what's happening in another part of the world, especially for people that are not able to travel for
Yeah,
X, Y, Z reasons. So thank
yeah.
you for sharing that with us. Uh, Thank you for the kiss. Delves into the concept of resilience, perseverance, and the struggle to rebuild one's life after profound loss and grief, as you said earlier. What message or insight do you hope readers take away from Gina's journey, especially in terms of overcoming adversity and finding inner strength?
Hmm. I thought about that a lot, actually. What message would a reader take away from that? I'll be really honest with you. I think that after the experience that Gina had, there are a couple of ways one could actually look at that and just make a decision for oneself about how one's going to carry on. Either they decide they made a big mistake and the past is the past. They won't do that again, hoping that they don't catch themselves in another situation where they do the same thing again. But I think if any reader reads the story, I would hope that if they find themselves in a similar situation, which in fact, in the story, it's a situation that many men and women who go to Cuba find themselves in. They get caught up in the local exoticness of the place, and they get heady. It's like they're on drugs, even if they're not taking drugs, they get heady. As I said earlier, there's a magic in Cuba that really affects a person, and they can't help themselves doing the things they do. There is maybe there's like an inner something in they know had so much good stuff going on in their lives in their own country. They've been lucky. They want to spread that luck and give somebody else a chance. Maybe that's what happens. But by doing that, by wanting to help, one has to be really careful of what is the reason why you want to help somebody. And if you do help somebody, are you prepared for the consequences that are going to take place? And the consequences from the stories I've heard are never a happy ending. So I would caution people that when they travel, remember the culture into which they are stepping. It's not your culture. Respect that culture. If you're going to get involved heavily, be prepared for the consequences and don't beat yourself up at the end because it's an experience that probably is going to enrich you in some way. Maybe it'll enrich the other person. In this story, it doesn't enrich anybody at the end. And I'd say Gina was left feeling devastated and at the same time negative to what had happened. So it's a story that I would let the reader make a decision for themselves. Would they have behaved in that way? Or would they have been more cautious? Or if they had not been cautious, how are they going to walk away from that situation? If they have an inner strength, they will decide for themselves, okay, I screwed up. That's it, fine. I've screwed up many times in my life. I've screwed up this time, and I'm not going to take it on board. But I will just be more careful and just hope and pray that the people that were also affected by the experience are not left too devastated. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing these empowering questions to the watchers and the readers of the book. And I'd like to close with one last bonus question.
Oh, bonus
How did your
question.
friends, your colleagues, the people that you know, how have they responded to your debut novel? What's the feedback you have received from them?
Hmm.
What have they told you?
Um, Some people absolutely loved the story. Some people said, I was screaming at the beginning, knowing that Gina was making mistakes and saying, how can she be so stupid? What's wrong with her? Many of my female friends said, how could Gina have done what she did? And they were like holding their heads singing, oh my God. Uh, Others said they loved the descriptions. They really felt as though they had been transported to Cuba and they could really picture everything that was described about Havana, the people, the food, the smells. They really got a good sense. And I'm really pleased that they got a good sense of place about Cuba. Really happy about that. So, yeah, it was very varied. Thank you for asking me that question.
Thank you, Beth, for being so original, so authentic. You are one of a kind. I really enjoy your writing style.
Thank
And I
you.
would like to wish you from the depths of my heart all the best to your next baby, which I've heard is going to be titled as Don't Shout, I Can Hear You,
Yes,
another memoir.
yes.
And I'm looking forward to it. So best of luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yanni, for taking the time to interview me, giving me an opportunity to talk a little bit about the book. There's a lot more, but I think I don't want to give too much away. I hope when the next person or people read the book, they will get a good sense of what the writer or the author is trying to say in the story. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. Bye bye.
Bye.